Good morning, everyone. Hello. I apologize for being tardy. Um, I'm Dr. Cheryl Carr, your work doctor, and this is the Achieve with Dr. C broadcast. Welcome. Please make sure that you like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you get notification of this broadcast every time I'm live. As well as you can make comments and I will answer if you have questions, especially during this post. Even if you're watching this by rebroadcast, I will make absolutely sure to address any questions you post, because my show usually, there's very few people live, but I have a lot of views afterwards. And I think this particular subject, which I'm actually going to be teaching on in depth with an education association this weekend in a webinar. But I want to talk to you about grieving well today, because as many of you may or may not know, just this past week, I had to put my beloved pet Milo to sleep. He suffered from congestive heart failure. He had many issues with his heart over the last 2 years. God graciously gave him to me for 2 more years past when they said he was not viable and that I should pick a date. That was 2 years ago. But he lived past that on multiple medications that he took 2 times a day, that I faithfully made sure he had, preserved his quality of life up until last Monday, when his heart was too enlarged. So I made the choice to end his suffering. And it's very grief striking. I mean, I'm grieving because I've had that dog for 10 years. He was my bestest little friend and buddy, and I have to get used to things being different without him. I think it's grace of God that when I first got Milo, my brother was with me, my baby brother, James, who I'll be interviewing next week on my show. I'll talk to you guys more about that. But also, he was here at the end of Milo's life with me as we had to say goodbye to him. I think that's God's grace. He was his best buddy, had known him his whole life. And my brother's a dog person. So I see God's grace and mercy in even that small thing. That he was here at the beginning and he was here at the last, so I wasn't alone dealing with having a dog. And a lot of you may not know, I'm actually allergic to dog dander. Never wanted a pet, but I got Milo because my pastor recommended I get a puppy so I would stop trying to love and nurture knuckleheads. And those were his exact words. And he felt like that would really help me with my commitment to avoid recreational sex, stop being with guys that didn't care about me and love me, because I was looking for nub, as he also said, looking for nub. So I would stop looking for love in all the wrong places. And it really was such a blessing. I was able to nurture and care for and baby that dog. He's very spoiled, as Kelly and my brother noted when they cleaned all of his things out for me. And we donated to Dogs in Need so that my pampered, spoiled pooches things would be a blessing for other dogs that could use it. I only kept a couple of toys to go with his ashes and things. That I'm setting up a little section that's just my Milo section, because I'm used to having him around all the time. I'm used to him being right here at my feet when I'm working. So I'm going through a new normal. I'm encountering a lot of people as part of this pandemic are experiencing the same thing I am. And it may not be from the loss of a loved one, but we've lost our way of life. We've lost possessions. We've lost careers, jobs. And we're all experiencing a collective battle with grief. And one of the things that I think it's important to note is that grief is very personal. It is not the same for everyone. We all experience it in our own unique ways. So the things I'm going to be sharing with you today are only recommendations, and they give you information to associate the process of grief with something you can kind of hang your hat on, that you don't have to experience it not knowing what's going on, what you're feeling, why you're feeling the way you are, why you're processing things the way you are. So I think it's really important to note there's a process to grief. It's been documented by Elizabeth Kubler, I think it's Ross. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was one of the first psychotherapist psychologists to actually document grief as a process and what we experience in grief. It's a dreaded process. The human experience avoids death and loss at all costs. And many of us have developed a very unhealthy way of grieving, that we would benefit from learning more information about grief so that we can hang our hats on something so we can grieve well. And as my sister has told me over and over again, my sister Yolanda, it's important to let your heart break. It's important to go through the process of grieving and to grieve well. So let's get into it, because I have the misfortune of being very familiar with loss. Ever since I was 5 years old, tragically lost my beloved daddy, Eugene Carr, in a car accident. And so that started a process of having to cope with death and loss all of my life. You know, I've lost every generation, my mother, my father, my stepfather, James White, my mother, Lois, my grandparents, Inez and Cammie. I've lost children, my son, Darrell, my daughter, Shatera, and now my Milo, uncles, aunts, cousins, nieces, a niece. So there's been a lot of loss in my life. So I'm familiar with this process and actually incorporate it into a lot of my counseling, because a lot of times once I scratch the surface of someone having some emotional issues or behavior issues, I usually find out it's connected to not processing grief. There was some major loss or major disruption in life that was subdued or pushed away so it wouldn't have to be faced. And that began a process of grieving unhealthy, which we can do, and it leads us down a very bad path. So I'm grateful for knowing how to grieve, at least, you know, psychologically. I know the process, which I'm going to explain to you in detail. But I also want to caution you to not try and call out where you might be in a process of grieving. If this triggers something in you, once you hear this information, please be sure to take the advice I'm going to give at the end on how to grieve. I'll also allow for contact. I have a simple practice, a telehealth practice that I am more than happy to listen to you, talk to you, and help you maybe find help that you need, or at least have a conversation about your grief, which is very important. So let's get into this. As I said, there are about 4 different grief stages that have been researched to generalize the human experience when we experience loss or death. And it's important to note that loss and death are major life events that don't necessarily involve death. That's why I'm dividing them into death and loss, because loss triggers the same emotional process that grief does, because it's a letting go. And I think it's important to note grief is a natural reaction to loss. You are not at fault or bad, or there's something wrong with you, because when you lose someone, like I'm saying, we're in this pandemic, we have lost jobs, homes, cars, careers, people, loved ones that have succumbed to the virus. We've lost pets. We've lost a lot. So we are collectively in a grief process on this whole entire planet. And I think talking about grief is something that's very important to do, and to not bury it, to not push it away. And if you bury grief, it becomes unfinished business. Because if you don't allow your heart to break and you don't allow yourself to grieve well, it's unfinished business in your psyche. It's going nowhere until you process it. And grief buried shows up in many ways. It shows up in post-traumatic stress disorder. It shows up in depression. It shows up in addiction. It shows up in being very socially inept because of the isolation that you experience in the first stages of grief. So I think it's very important to allow your heart to break and to understand grief is a process. And let's talk about this process. And again, I'm talking about it with the research done by psychologist and psychotherapist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she diagnosed 5 stages of grief. It's a grief process. And also note, mourning is the process of grief. And you need an appointed season to do that. I have set a process of grieving and mourning for the loss of Milo. I did that for myself because I know that's healthy to grieve well. I've built in things that I know make me feel better, but also help me not to push away grief. And so it's painful but fruitful work to go through processing grief and loss and death. It's fruitful work, because in the end, you will find sometimes death is a reset. And loss is a reset. It's also very clarifying. Things become so unimportant when there's a clarifying life event that you just can't push away, you can't escape. You have to deal with it. So it really does depend on how great the loss was and your spiritual, mental, and emotional fortitude to do this work of grieving well. It's a process God designed for humankind to produce healing and readiness to re-engage with life in the future. That's why you have to mourn. And that's why you have to grieve well. And that's why you have to know yourself. Like I said, your mental, emotional, and spiritual fortitude will dictate how you go through this grief process. So let's talk about the grief process as it's diagnosed and described by this study of how humans grieve. The first thing is denial. That's usually the first phase. And again, these are not meant to label you, they're meant to inform you. So you know and identify a process to grieving. There's really no way to know where you are in this process. It takes someone you love and trust calling out for you and checking in with them. And denial is that first push the mind goes to when there is an extreme loss, an overwhelming of emotions, and an inability to do something. And that's grief. Because it, like I said, we avoid it. And yes, goddess, that is the human state. And that's the reason for this broadcast, is because we don't grieve well. And it's good for you to recognize that, but it's a learned process, just like everything else. So I hope in listening to the broadcast and me sharing my grief process and the grief process that a psychologist know, I hope it will help you. I hope it will share something with you to help you unearth some grief and to deal with the unfinished business of grief, because it doesn't go away. So with denial being that first phase, reality shifts when you experience loss or death. And that includes, like I said, loss of a job, loss of your career, loss of a home, loss of a car, loss of livelihood and money, and just your status in life. Those are losses. Loss of a spouse, divorce, separation, children leaving home when they're grown and they're off to college. That ignites a new reality. Reality isn't what it was and what you're comfortable with. So you're thrust into grappling or experiencing the unknown. And again, the brain doesn't like that. And that's why it goes to denial, because that's a slowing down of what's happening for the brain until it can catch up with how you should feel, what you should do. And that's why a lot of times in denial, you will see people doing a lot of activities, taking care of things, because that gives the brain an ability to function. And remember, I taught back when I taught about habit forming, that a lot of times the brain forms habits for efficiency. The brain likes to be efficient. And it will do that when you're in denial about an overwhelming emotion, loss, and death. So that's the first stage you will experience. And you have sometimes, if you've been in an accident, or like what I experienced with my dog going into heart failure, you have very painful imagery and experiences in that loss that are overwhelming to the brain. So it is very perfectly normal to go into denial as a first phase of grieving. And to understand, you probably don't know you're in denial until it's called out for you. And remember, I had said earlier, it's really important to let someone near you let you know what's the reality of your situation, and to say it for you so the brain can hear it until you're ready to start telling yourself the truth. There was a loss. That's gone. That's over. That role in your life is done. So, my recommendation in order to grieve well is that in denial, which is usually the first stage of grief, you find someone who can help tell you the truth. And then start telling yourself the truth when you're ready. I had to tell myself, he's gone. Milo's gone. I had to say that to myself so many times that first night. So my brain could begin to figure out we're experiencing loss. It's happening. It's not going to change. The second phase in the grief process that's a lot harder to accept than even denial, and that's anger. Anger is not an emotion. It's an emotion few people deal with well. And I think it's because we refuse to accept the scripture and the principle that says you can be angry, just don't sin. Because anger pushes a button of emotions that's all encompassing. It leaves no stone unturned. And if you let it work its way out to your behaviors, you're contentious, you're argumentative, you don't speak to other people well, you don't treat other people well, you don't even treat yourself well when you're angry. So it's really important when you recognize anger it's a surface emotion, and it's very easy to rise to the top. Once you've gone through denial, the brain has sped up. It accepts what's going on. There's some reality to the loss and the death. Then you'll start to feel that anger because you can't fix it. You can't change it. You can't make it go away. So anger bubbles up, and it's a natural response. I have a process of dealing with my anger. My first process is cut my words in half to realize this tongue will feed what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and then it will leak out to my behaviors where I'm a fuse lit. And this is how people go into fits of rage and anger and end up doing something drastic that they regret for the rest of their lives. So it's really important in the anger phase. Another process I have is I isolate when I'm feeling really, really angry, because I know what I'm capable of when I'm mad. So I just don't go out in public when I'm experiencing that. And I'm bad in traffic too. So I try to avoid driving. So anger is a release of emotions to loss and death that's very surface and very acceptable. That you're angry, you're frustrated, you're not happy that the loss of the death can't be changed. You can't bargain with God, which is the next phase. And so my recommendation when you're experiencing anger is that you don't isolate, and that you seek comfort, connection, and reassurance with people who love you. This is not the time for new friends. It's not the time for new friends. This is the time to go to your day ones, the people who will love you through this and connect with you, even though you're not pleasant to be around. So remember that when you get to that phase. The next phase of grief in this process is bargaining. And that's the brain processing as well. You begin to Remember things you did wrong that you wish you could change. If you only got one more chance, you would say, I love you. If you only got one more chance, you wouldn't have let them leave when you were angry. If you only got one more chance, you would do things differently. And that's a normal process too. I want you to know bargaining is very good. Isolating and sleep, that's another good thing. That's another good thing to do. Sleep is important. And I've been sleeping a lot too. I isolate with someone aware that I'm isolating. Like I said, this is a time for your day ones to reassure you, to connect with you, and to just let you be you. So, I let my friends, I got such an outpouring of love and people checking on me and making sure I was okay. And that was the time I needed to let them know, I'm running away from home. I'm getting ready to go do this. And then I'm a sleeper girl. I love my sleep. So taking my naps is very natural and necessary. And I'm also still recovering from COVID. And so sleep is really important. I love that. But in this bargaining phase, when you're helpless, you feel no control, you're recalling your failures, you're bargaining with yourself that, oh, I wish I could change it. Oh, I wish God would fix it. God help me. I mean, all the things that you pray and lost. This is an important phase to begin to associate only pleasant memories. It goes back to the telling yourself the truth like you do in denial. When you feel yourself bargaining and wishful thinking or fantastical thinking, if only I had been more loving, they wouldn't have died, or only if I had not done this wouldn't have happened. That's all the bargaining phase in your mind. And it's really, really, really important to begin to recall the pleasant, the good things to overtake that bargaining phase, to tell yourself the truth again. The next phase that I really want to spend a little bit of time with, because I've dealt with this. I don't think there's a human on the planet that hasn't dealt with this. And I actually was diagnosed with major situational depression before. And that was when I lost my son. So there's a depression stage to loss and death and grief that is normally where people pull up and park and hang a while. When I teach my courses and when I teach about emotional health and behavioral health, and I try to teach people to treat emotions as visitors. Let them come and then process them so they can go. But just like grief, when you don't go through the process or allow yourself to move along in the process and seek therapy if you need it, and help if you need it, and conversations if you need it. And again, I'm going to provide information at the end of the show to help. You will find yourself with unfinished business, and grief turned inward turns into depression and deep depression. Now, there's a depression that's just a natural. I had COVID, and a lot of people don't remember my son, Darrell. There's a few people that remember when I was pregnant. It was a long time ago, but of course, love my babies. So, when you're dealing with depression, there's clinical depression, and then there's just the emotions of depression. Depression can be said overwhelming sadness. Depression that's clinical is actually it's more than just overwhelming sadness. It actually affects your behavior. It affects your quality of life, and it needs counseling and possible therapy to help you come to a point where you're healthy, where you're processing your depression and you're recognizing that you've gone into a stage of depression that you can't get out of, where you're emotionally not the same, you're mentally not the same, behavioral wise, you're not the same. You're not who you want to be. In this phase, you can also, especially if you go into clinical depression, you can become suicidal as well. And I'm definitely reaching through this broadcast. If you are in a state of depression, there is help. You don't have to go through this alone. There are those of us out here that have survived it. We're on the other side of it. We have healthy, happy lives. We have learned coping skills and ways to manage our life so that when depression comes, which it does, it's overwhelming sadness. And we all have it. And collectively on this planet, COVID and the pandemic and all the losses and loss of loved ones, loss of all of our possessions. There's some people that have lost everything. Everything they worked so hard for. That is depressing. But I want you to know you can get help. I'll be sharing in the post. I'll be sharing my telehealth. You can reach out to me. We can have Zoom meetings. You don't have to turn your camera on. I can talk to you. I can refer you. Please understand depression is a natural stage of grieving. And if you're having overwhelming sadness, that's your quality of life is downgraded. You can't get out of bed. You don't want to talk to people. And I think you need to know there's help. I want to say this to you, and thank you for sharing that. A lot of people are too ashamed to share what they're feeling. Emotions can be very scary. Depression can be very frightening because you want yourself to get better, but you really need help. And if you're not able to talk with someone about your depression, I think it's really important to maybe look for a different therapist. And it's important to know people help seek and get therapy with people that may not be qualified. As Black people, we normally go to our church and our pastors, and they may not be trained to deal with clinical depression. They can help you spiritually. They're a great resource for talking and sharing. But when it comes to actually helping you manage depression and prescribing medication, if you're taking medication for it, I'm a naturopathic person. I believe in functional medicine and the plants and food that God gave us on earth. And I've been relying on those things. But it's thank you for getting help for your depression. Thank you for sharing that, because I think people are too ashamed and won't tell people what they're experiencing. And I'm grateful you're not suicidal, because you don't want to let your depression get to that point. So please understand, depression is a natural stage of grieving, and that's overwhelming sadness. It's overwhelming. You just can't feel like yourself. You can't get past the sadness. And that can deepen into clinical depression. And that's where you need help. That's where you need to go see a professional. And there's so many ways to get help for depression. There's so many ways. And I will share a lot of those ways with you. Are they perfect? No. Are we perfect therapists and coaches and psychotherapists and psychologists? No, we're not perfect. We're just humans. And many of us have been through things and we want to help other people. So let's talk about this last phase of grief. And that's acceptance. And you can't rush to this. You got to go through your go through. But when you get to acceptance, you begin to realize that life has to have a new normal, that your life has been reset and there's new beginnings, and you stop struggling with the other phases of grief as much. They may show up, but they're lightened and they're not as intense. And one thing I do want to say, you're not nuts. You're human. That's just the human state. And it may be that you need a different therapist. And that's fine. Yes, I'll put a link in, and you're more than welcome to reach out to me. My first consultation is no cost. And that's just where I talk to you, because I'm not a licensed psychologist. I'm a certified psychotherapist and positive applied psychologist. I have to make sure if you need prescriptions and things like that, that I can refer you to the person to do that. But I can definitely help with behaviors and emotional state and talk therapy. Definitely have that. I'll be sharing that link. Feel free to click the link and set an appointment with me. Happy to talk to you. Very happy to talk to you. So let's finish talking about acceptance. Acceptance is when you get to the reality of the situation. You've told yourself the truth. You've processed your anger. You've done your bargaining. You have worked your way to understanding you're depressed, you're overwhelmingly sad, but you're not clinical, so you can move along. Awesome. That's even better. So yeah, let's make sure we connect. I'm going to share the link with you, and I may even go into your inbox and share it with you so we can talk. So now that you got through acceptance, one of the big things I want to share with you about going through the grief process is please avoid any major life decisions. When you're going through this process, and it can take as long as it needs to take so that you don't have the unfinished business of grieving, I think it's important to know that making life decisions when you're in this crucible, this change, is usually you're not going to make the best decision, or a decision you would have even made had you not been grieving, had you not been mourning. So at this point, all my major life decisions, like my first thought was to run away and move. So that was like a first grief response. It's very normal for me because, I'm fearless when it comes to stuff like that. But I went ahead and signed, and I'm going to stay where I'm at. So avoid major life decisions when you're grieving. You're not yourself. Those quality decisions that you need to make for your life can't be made in the stages of grief. So remember, those 5 stages are just recommendations. They're just identifiers, something you can hang your hat on to understand where you might be in grieving, and help you to grieve well. That's the main point of this whole entire conversation and broadcast. And you're very brave to admit that you don't grieve well. Hopefully, some of this information and a conversation, I can help you and help myself too. That's, you know, I'm grieving right now too, and I don't want unfinished business. I did not grieve well when I lost my son, and that's how I ended up in a major situational depression that I had to get counseling for. I unfortunately can't take antidepressants. I'm one of those 1% that experiences a serotonin uptake disorder when they introduce antidepressants and medication. So I found natural methods that I swear by and will never give up. And they helped me greatly. But I also went through my full therapeutic therapy and counseling, and I did my work so that I could get to a point where I was happy again. And that's been years and years and years ago, but I still use what I learned in that counseling and in dealing with my depression. I still use those life skills and those coping skills, and they work for me even right now in losing my low precious Milo. So I pray something I said today helps you, encourages you, helps you shift out of not understanding why you're feeling or behaving or doing the things you're doing when you've experienced loss, which again, I want to call out, your loss of your job can throw you into a grief cycle. Loss of home, loss of your career, loss of all the things that we've experienced during this pandemic, all can collectively place us in a grief state. PTSD, post-traumatic stress, witnessing the illness of COVID is very traumatizing. I know how sick I was, and I check in on my brother all the time because he was my caregiver, thank God, in other medical professions. But that's very traumatizing to see someone that ill. So those painful imagery can throw you into a grief cycle. So praying something was said, listen to this broadcast over and over again. Please go to my YouTube, subscribe to that channel so you can get notifications when I'm broadcasting live. I'm also going on to other platforms. That's all in the works. I'm not exactly sure how that will work out with the show, but I'm here most Mondays, 10 a.m. CST. This is the Achieve with Dr. C show. I'm your work Dr. Cheryl Carr, and it's been a pleasure sharing this experience with you all. If you're watching the rebroadcast, please make sure you check my posts for the numbers, which I can give the 1-800 number. If you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling suicidal, you can call 800-662-4357. And there are counselors on that line that are willing and able to help you get the help you need. You are not alone. Grief feels lonely and isolating, and you feel like nobody else feels like you're feeling, but you're not alone. I've been depressed. I'm grieving. I know what that feels like. I can empathize with you, even though pain is relative. Your pain is your pain, but the human state, we all go through it. So again, that number is 800-662-4357. If you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling suicidal, please reach out. There is help. You can get through this. There are people willing and able to help you grieve well. Bye for now. See you guys on the next broadcast.